after the call. So probably tomorrow we'll get everything together and get it out. So with that, let's get started here. Today is our first real TRID training for the new year. We want to cover a couple of things with you. We want to cover the overview and our contact information again, some TRID Q&A, and an issue invite that I'm very passionate about and talk about later. But look, we're live. We want to put names and faces together today. So overview and contact. This training really represents the questions most asked and answered over the last couple of months. And because we've had so many of the same questions raised, we thought it would be a good idea to put this training together. Based on continual questions, we may do this every quarter. But with that being said, we're going to cover today the most asked and answered questions of the TRID team over the last couple of months. And with that being said, let me introduce the TRID team to you. I'm Holly Guest. I'm your Chief Compliance Officer. I'm located in Dallas, Texas. On the phone with me is Andrew Baez. He's our corporate counsel. He's located in Diamond Bar, California. And you all know Toby Hoy. He's located in North Canton, Ohio. He is also going to co-facilitate this presentation with you. We're splitting questions. Again, if you could put yourself on mute while we're talking through the presentation, it'd be greatly appreciated. So really, the three of us make up the TRID team, and we receive and review every email that's sent to the TRID team, which is TRID_team@bancorp.com. We look at every one of them. We come together and we meet on them, and we make sure that we're all on the same page with our responses, and then one of us will respond to everybody that's on the question or in the email. One thing we do ask of you is to make sure that you include a borrower's name, loan number, and the complete scenario or question so that we don't have to go back and forth. We want to get to you as quickly as possible because it's very important. We want to make sure we're respectful of everybody's time. So with that being said, here's your TRID team. We're here to help you. We want to get your questions answered timely. And again, thank you for your time today. We hope that this information will be useful for you down the road. Okay, so we broke up the presentation into various slides, and as you can see, Andrew's up first. He's going to handle a few items, and we're going to turn it over to Toby and then myself, and we'll end the presentation with some Q&A. So with that being said, Andrew, it's all yours.
Good afternoon. So I want to talk about something that has come up a few times recently. Some of this is stuff that you already know, and some of it might be a little bit new, but hopefully it'll be a reminder and maybe new information that'll help you guys get your loans done and processed the way they're supposed to be. So obviously, COC, we're talking about change of circumstance. In the regulations under TRID, obviously most of you probably already know this, you do this all the time on all of your loans, that once you're going from a float and you lock your loan, a COC has to be issued and sent out to the borrower so they know that their loan's now locked in the terms of their specific rate lock. What may not be known is that we've had this situation come up where after it's been locked, the lock is going to be expiring, and there's the borrower maybe, for whatever reason, the lock's going to be expiring, or it's going to be canceled, and it's going to go back to floating for a while because you don't want to cancel that in case, at some point later in time, you're able to go ahead and still help this borrower with this property and this loan. So you want to go from lock back to float. The regulations require the same COC at that time within 3 days of going back to float, just like you do when you go from float to lock. We've had a few instances where when that has happened, and the explanation again was just as I said, that they don't, they were going to go back to this loan and leave it open so we don't have to start a whole new loan process for this borrower if they're going to actually go through with our loan. They figured it'd just be easier to leave that as an active loan, but just let it float. But unfortunately, without doing the COC, it ended up being a cancel and having to cancel that loan anyways. Because what happens with the regulation is this part of the regulation does not have a cure provision. There's no fee that we can pay just to make it compliant and be good. There's no way for us to fix that problem if it isn't done under the regulation. And so if the loan were to close without having done that COC, the loan is just not TRID compliant and we won't be able to sell that loan. So that's the reason why we have to be very careful when we're doing these, to make sure that we're aware when do we have these hard stop COCs that we've got to get done, and this is one when it's either going from float to lock or from lock back to float, and it's got to be within 3 days because we will get caught. It's clear in the file, so we have to know that we get that done within 3 days. Next slide. Section B, changes, appraisal, and credit reports. So under Section B, obviously these kinds of things, there are, every now and then we will disclose what the anticipated fee is going to be, and there are times where that then increases, right? It may, the cost increases, and so, you know, we want to go ahead and there's times where we can pass it on and times where we can't. We have to remember that in order to reset those tolerances with the COC, there has to be a valid reason for that COC. So a couple of examples here is we started with one borrower adding a cosigner. We can go ahead, you know, some of the costs will increase. We can go ahead and change with a COC, and that will reset. There's a rush fee, something we didn't know that was happening, where all of a sudden we needed to get the appraisal done quicker, so there's a fee that wasn't originally anticipated. It's not a regular part. There are times where some of these fees we know of at the beginning of the process, and our templates anticipate all those scenarios. Like I know with conventionals on credit reports, we do soft pulls at the end just to make sure they haven't taken out any additional credit that would affect their DTIs. So our templates have been amended and adjusted. The fees that we assume include that in there. If you reduce it down when you do your original LE, and then we end up doing that soft pull at the end that we know we do as a process on all of our conventionals, that's not going to be something that we're going to be able to do a COC and have that fee, have those fees readjusted. That's going to end up being a cure. So we have to make sure that we have a valid reason for those COCs before when they're going to be done. Otherwise, we're going to have to cure them. Next slide. Seller concessions, extra or unused. This is one that's come up a number of times as far as, well, when we get to the end of it, we're getting to docs, and now because the borrower has to pay their minimum contribution, we have to reduce the seller credit that the credit the seller is offering. And what can we do with that to allow the borrower to use up as much of that credit the seller is willing to give them? So things that we can do, we can use that to buy down the rate. So if you want to go ahead and there's an additional pricing hit to them, we can use the credit to pay that. If there are other, whatever fees are out there, the one that has come up that we cannot do it is to reimburse the borrower's appraisal fee. That is something, it's already been paid out of pocket, it's already done, and it's a logistical nightmare to try and recapture that. So we cannot recapture the appraisal fee. That's one that's, if it was going to be credited, it would need to be paid by the borrower off of their card, because we're having that go directly to the appraisal management company. That's not something that's internal to us, that we have the money internally for them. So that one we can't do, but we can buy down the rate. And so you've got to take into consideration, obviously there's considerations of, you know, going back to the lock desk and how much time that may take, but we have got to go ahead and make sure that we take those considerations and then decide what we're going to do with that. With that, I don't remember if I have one more slide, or if I do, I have one more slide. E-sign and wet sign docs. Yes. So e-sign and wet sign CDs, okay? We generally prefer, please, if we can, let's get the e-sign CDs. And I understand, you know, sometimes there's issues, borrowers can't get to a computer or whatever, so we've got to print it out and have them sign them. What will not be acceptable, please do not do this. We will not accept a picture on your phone of the document that the borrower signed. It has to be an actual scan of the document that comes back in, and we also need to obtain the original the document with the original signature. So when the borrower, we have to actually have the one with the actual pen that went to paper, so that we can have that as well in case we get questioned by our investors. We need to be able to provide that to them. So we are able to do wet sign even if there's two borrowers, and just remember the later date is going to be the one that's going to trigger if it's our initial CD. That later date is the one that's going to start your 3-day waiting period before docs and being able to consummate the transaction. So be cognizant of that, but we need the actual wet signature. You can submit in a scanned copy, but not a photograph of the document. Okay, and with that, I turn it over to Mr. Hoy.
Mr. Hoy, and again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to use the chat box. We're watching that throughout the presentation. And then Andrew, if you have any comments, don't hesitate to jump in. Hey, Toby, it's you.
Oh, party, my turn. So we've had a couple of these scenarios have popped up where the initial CD has been sent on the transaction, and for one reason or another, there was either a need or a desire to add another borrower to the loan after the initial CD has been sent. And unfortunately, there is no possible way to make that work within the confines of the regulation. The challenge is there's two parts of that. It's specifically called out in the TRID that once the initial CD is generated, a loan estimate cannot be subsequently issued after that under any reason. So there's that to consider. And then the second problem is all consumers or all borrowers on that transaction have to have received that loan estimate within 3 business days of making application. So if we're adding somebody after the CD has gone out, they can't get a loan estimate. So they're deprived of the joy of receiving the loan estimate in that scenario. So if that initial CD is out, the only way at that point to add a new borrower would be to decline the first transaction for whatever the reason that we're adding the second borrower to, or the another borrower to overcome. So whether it's thin credit or debt ratio or whatever the scenario is, we'd have to decline the first loan. They'd have to start an entirely new transaction, and then do a whole new initial disclosure package, wait the 10 days, do the CD, the whole 9 yards. So it seems clunky and ridiculous, but there's no mechanism within the regulation to do that. So in that case, it's important to not send the initial CD until you've got everything dialed in and you know exactly what consumers are going to be on the transaction as far as adding more borrowers. So go ahead and click on to the next slide for me. Adding borrowers can be done at any time during the LE stage of a transaction. So anytime before that initial CD has gone out, we can add borrowers or take borrowers away from now until the cows come home as many times as you want. Keep in mind that every time you add or subtract a borrower from that transaction, it's going to have to go back and be re-underwritten. In the event the addition or removal of a borrower is going to change the pricing on that loan. So let's say, for example, we added on a spouse that wasn't on the loan to begin with because their score is less than the borrower, but we needed to add them in after the fact to make up for a higher debt ratio or whatnot. So now we're going to have to price on a different score. Then that obviously would require a change of circumstance for the change in price at that point, go out within 3 business days of the addition of that borrower in that as an example. So go ahead and click on to the next slide for me. And same thing with removing a borrower. Borrowers can come off at any time of the transaction. Borrowers can come off after the initial CD has gone out. That's fine. But again, if you take somebody away, it's going to have to go back and be re-underwritten, and that could have a corresponding change in price as well. So go ahead and click on to the next slide for me. However, we jumped around a little bit. So cure requests. We had added some object permissions into Byte to prevent the cure field from being overridden. So we had a couple scenarios where there were cures being put onto files that didn't need to be there because the system calculated them, and the system calculated them accurately, but there was another reason as to why they were there, so we could argue it a little bit. So in that case, when the TRID is not, or the cure, excuse me, is not going to be a system calculated cure, the TRID team is reviewing those. We are the only ones that have the ability to override that field. So processors can't override the field, loan officers, branch managers, doctor Rs, nobody can override that field with the exception of the 3 of us in that special. So what we've been doing is, in the event that the TRID, or the cure is minimal, 10, 20 bucks, give or take, we're just going in and overriding the cure to put it on there. The times where it's been more than that, 10, 20 buck-ish amount, we've reached out to the branch manager or the LO or whomever is appropriate to make sure that there's a reason that they want to go ahead. Do you want to eat that cost, or do you want to, if it's possible, do a COC and wait at that point to move on for that? So we've added that security profile as well. So we're reviewing all those files, and we've had to override cure on that particular transaction. So go ahead and click to the next slide for me. Nope, go back one. There we go. So one other big issue that's happened is, once those docs are signed, I don't care, it doesn't matter if the docs are back or not, but once that consumer goes to title or escrow, they take a pen and they write their name on 68 different times on those closing documents. That, at that point, locks in everything. So we can no longer add fees of any kind, stripe, shape, flavor, or form onto that transaction, regardless of the reason. So what typically happens in this scenario is there is an unexpected delay for whatever reason on that transaction, and the lock expires, or the lock is going to expire and would need to be extended. There is no mechanism, once those docs are signed, to pass that cost on to the consumer. There is no mechanism to pass that cost on to the seller of the property. There is no mechanism to pass that cost on to the realtor of that on that transaction. The only person or only entity at that point that can cover that lock extension is going to be the branch. So unless you want to fight with the lock desk to get the extension fee waived, and I will let you argue with the lock desk to your heart's content on that, and that will be between you and the lock desk. So there is no mechanism to change the transaction at that point once those docs are signed. Also, once those docs are signed, there is no more adding of borrowers, taking away borrowers, nothing. So that it carves the transaction into proverbial stone at that point once the docs are signed. It doesn't matter the reason behind it or why the crazy thing happened. There's no mechanism to change, fix, or modify that. The only option at that point is, if there is a needed change to the transaction, would be to decline or cancel that transaction and start over again. I can't stress that enough. This is not our policy. This is not the investor policy. This is for all intents and purposes, this is federal law. So we can't deviate from that. And I believe that was the end of my section. So Holly, I believe you are up next.
Thank you, Toby. And let me reiterate something here that I said earlier. So the TRID team is here for you. It's TRID_team at Bancorp. We want to be proactive with you. I said on the very first slide, we want the name and the number and all that. So what you just heard were all the most recent, and we got several questions of the same information, same questions asked, same answers given, hence the whole purpose for this training. But we, because we've got the time zones covered for you, Pacific, Central, and East Coast, we're here for you, and we want to be proactive with you. So a lot of the questions that we get are things that have already happened, right? So now how do we fix this? What can we do? Is there a cure? How do we change this? If you know that there might be something kind of going on with the loan, ping us in advance. Let us look at the scenario up front before you sign docs, before you issue the CD. If you know about something and you can get the run on it and you can email us, please do, because like I said, we all meet together so that we can come up with a collective answer to get it out to you. Just kind of passing that information on. We want to be as proactive as we possibly can with you, because we are here to help you and answer those questions for you. Moving on to the one bite item I want to discuss, and I'm real passionate about this one. This is about documenting that darn loan file. And I know I know who's on this call. I've darn near talked to every one of you about this in one way or another. If I get you on the phone, I'm going to bring this up. And the reason why I'm passionate about it is because compliance is responsible for our state examinations, any federal state examination, and also responsible for any consumer complaint. So I'm telling you, documentation is key in both of those areas. Being able to keep the loan detailed, fill out those conversation logs, enter that information, save your emails, save your text messages. I can tell you, and this is the truth, we have been able to go back and retrieve text messages when we talk to loan officers and such for either regulatory purposes or consumer complaints. And it ends the examiner's question, it ends the consumer complaint when we fully document what transpired in a loan. So again, if something's kind of not feeling right and you want to document it, it's better to document. More is better in this case for sure, so that we can go back and look at what's in the con log, see what has been saved in Byte in the document store for those purposes. If you need any other help or questions, have questions on this information or this particular item, please don't even hesitate to reach out to me personally on this one. Pick up the phone. I want to talk to you about it in more detail because this one is extremely, extremely important to all of us. With that being said, questions. We have time for questions because we've ended a little early. So if you have any questions, I don't know, Toby, Andrew, did anybody, I haven't looked into the chat box.
I don't see a thing in the chat box, so I mean we can hang for a second. What we'll do is, excuse me, is there were some questions on the earlier call. So what we'll be doing, as Holly mentioned at the top of the hour, is we'll combine all of those into one FAQ document and post them out to the intranet with the recorded version of the session. Oh, and I'm starting to see some stuff pop into the chat room or the chat box. So, okay, Christina, what's your question? And then Alma, I'll jump into head. The changes became in effect on March 1st. These are not new. None of this is new. This is all stuff that has been, Alma, to answer your question, this is all stuff that has been part of TRID since 2015 when TRID went live. So nothing that we've talked about in the past 23 minutes has been anything new. So Christine, I don't know what your question is that you've stated that you have in the chat box, but if you can go ahead and type it in, we can get that question answered for you.
And if she doesn't, she can always email the TRID team and we will respond.
Oh, here we go. If we issue the CD and afterward learn that the seller agreed to pay for a repair we were unaware of that we have to redisclose? No, we do not. Seller costs do not affect our borrower. So as long as the final CD that goes out with the closing package has those repairs that the seller had paid for, that is not a problem at all. So that would not need to go back out to the consumer. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yes, and we will get all the Q&A out, plus this PowerPoint presentation, plus the recording, so you can have this for future reference, and we'll reevaluate in the next quarter how many questions we get. Maybe we'll do this quarterly. I think it's a good idea. It's always nice to touch base with you. Again, here's your TRID team. Don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you so much for your time. Andrew, Toby, thank you again. Appreciate it. Any questions? We look forward to hearing from you. Have a nice day.
Party on.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.